So we left off talking about Spain and their absolutism and absolutism in general. And I remember that absolutism is the idea that one person is going to rule an entire country and that they have been chosen by God in order to rule this country. France was no different, and France actually became the embodiment of absolutism. But in order to get there, there was a couple steps that had to be taken. So after the Reformation, or kind of during the Reformation, they definitely had some religious wars in France. Catherine de' Medici was a Catholic, and they didn't like the new Protestants that were coming about, specifically the Huguenots. Now, Huguenots were mostly aligned with the Calvinists in Switzerland, but they were also kind of known as the French Protestants. So the Huguenots is an important term for you guys to know. Catherine de' Medici did not like the Huguenots, though, and so she actually orchestrated something called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where a lot of the Protestant leaders were massacred one day in Paris, even though they were promised their safety. After Catherine de' Medici, Henry of Navarre takes over France, and he becomes what is known as Henry IV. He's a Huguenot king, so he was actually a Protestant, and he was the first of the Bourbon dynasty that would rule France for quite some time. Obviously, at first, Catholics really oppose Henry, and so he actually converts to Catholicism, and he famously said that Paris is worth a mass, saying that he was willing to convert to Catholicism in order to kind of keep the peace in France. He establishes something called the Edict of Nantes, where Huguenots are allowed to worship in some towns, so this is kind of the first step towards religious toleration in France. And Henry was a really stabilizing force in France and kind of brought it back so that the economy could run smooth and stuff like that. But he's eventually assassinated by a Catholic radical. After him, his son Louis the 13th takes over, but unfortunately he's pretty weak. He can't stand up for himself, and he needs help. So Cardinal Richelieu kind of rules France for a while. Now he's not a Bourbon member, but he is the chief counsel of Louis the 13th and is able to rule France in the correct direction. So the idea is that they wanted to increase the power of the monarch themselves. So they suppressed a lot of the Huguenots, they weakened the nobles' power, and by doing this, they actually increased the power of the government. And it's at this time that Richelieu is still fighting against the Habsburgs in Austria and other places as well. But the idea is that they really wanted to get as much power as possible to the Bourbons. During this time, you also had a period of writing and philosophy was changing a little bit. You had skepticism and empiricism that show up. So skepticism is that nothing can be known for certain. Michel de Montaigne, he develops essay writing, so you can blame him when you guys have to write your essays here pretty soon. And he had this idea that new beliefs will always replace the old beliefs, so nothing is really certain. And then René Descartes wrote something called Meditations on First Philosophy, and he says that you need observations to make truth. So this is the basis of empiricism, that you can't know anything until you prove it scientifically. So after Louis XIII, his son Louis XIV comes to power. Now he's the embodiment of absolutism. Henry IV and Richelieu set up power for Louis XIV, and Louis is able to say that I am the state. He inherits the throne at the age of 4, so obviously he's not able to rule at this point, but he has a Cardinal Mazarin who's able to run the government for him until he becomes of age. During this time of the rule of the cardinal, they taxed nobles significantly, so there's actually protests and threats against the king, and people are tired of the uncertainty, especially the middle class, so they actually support the monarchy. And so Louis XIV, when he does take power, he remembers this threatening act by the nobles, and so he really tries to limit or weaken the nobles' authority completely. He empowered something called the intendants, who went around the country to collect taxes and administer justice. Now these were new nobles who had come to power just recently through the favors of Louis XIV, so they were really loyal to Louis XIV. And he kept nobles out of the councils, so the nobles under Louis's reign really lose a lot of their authority. There's a lot of economic growth as well during this time in France. Louis XIV had a finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was a huge supporter of mercantilism, and he wanted France to become self-sufficient. Now, with all this money that's coming into France, Louis spends extravagantly on himself. He had feasts and clothes, and he built this huge palace of Versailles with ridiculous gardens and everything. Um, so he was also known as the Sun King because of his extravagance. Like I said before, he had complete control of his nobles. He moved the capital to Versailles, where nobles actually had to go live there and kind of pay him homage and hold his shoes out to him and try to gain favor with the king. So the nobles became dependent on Louis and he took them from their home when he brought them to Versailles. The Sun King was also a patron of the arts. He opened opera and ballet places, then they became very popular. And he thought that the purpose of art was to glorify the monarch. And you can see some of the paintings here of Louis XIV here in his extravagant style. So Louis does fight in wars during his time, but he strengthens France to become the most powerful in continental Europe. He tries to expand the borders. He invades the Spanish Netherlands and the Dutch Netherlands. And the result of this is he does gain some small areas around France. But countries eventually band together against France, and they're led by this guy here, William of Orange, who is the King of England, who will eventually fight back. Now, this is an important war for you guys to know, is the War of Spanish Succession. With the death of Charles II of Spain, there's a lot of trouble, right? And so Charles II had actually promised Louis XIV's grandson the throne of Spain. And if this would have happened, it really would have given the Bourbons control of most of Europe. And so other countries felt very threatened. The balance of power was off. So they got to fight against France. So war breaks out. You got England, Austria, Dutch, Portugal, German states, Italian states, all versus France. All right, remember, this is to avoid a union of the French and the Spanish thrones, which would give the French control over all of Europe. The fighting lasts about 14 years, and Great Britain are the ones that kind of come out ahead of this. They weaken the French a little bit. They also gain Gibraltar and the French North American territories. And at the same time, Prussia and Savoy, some German states, are recognized.